setup. Just wanted to take some time to generally get everything kicked off on the right foot in terms of best practices for folder structure, file naming conventions, and settings within Cinema 4D. So first off, in terms of folder structure, this is generally the folder structure format that I utilize in my personal projects. It's slightly different than the one that I use at work, but for this it works fairly well in terms of smaller scale projects with perhaps one or a couple people on board. First off here, just having everything organized nicely in the proper order will just save a lot of headaches down the line in terms of setting up your render paths and getting everything exactly where it needs to be. The first folder here for documents is generally documents provided by the client, whether that's kickoff files for the brief that they have supplied. It could also just be kind of general documents that you would need in terms of invoicing or any documents that you'd be providing to the client. The second one here is pretty straightforward, just reference folder. Usually within that we'll have subfolders for different types of reference, if it's a specific concept that I'm pulling reference for or what have you. The third folder here is for assets, and within that I generally would have client-supplied assets and then perhaps gathered general assets. So client-supplied assets could be anything from specific vector logo files that they provide, CAD files, whatever the case may be. And then general assets are things that I've either prepared myself or gathered that I'll need to utilize throughout the project. The design folder generally just have a variety of my design explorations. I'll often have two subfolders for specific kind of design buckets that I'm working within. Right now, I'm just kind of keeping it simple with keeping this at the base root. But generally, it's also a good idea to have subfolders for each specific design bucket that you're working within. And then within that, you can actually have, specific folders for Cinema 4D, for After Effects, for Houdini, whatever you may need. The next folder here, again, pretty straightforward, is just any general decks that I will be creating throughout the project, client-supplied decks, kind of internal decks that I'm working on. It's usually the case of throughout the projects a variety of pitch decks, development decks, and this can house all of those here. Next folder here is for production, and after we have moved out of the design phase and I have a list of specific shots that I need to move into production, those will get transferred over into here just to generally kind of clean up the design space. And once everything is moving forward, you're able to kind of pull everything into there and have one cohesive space that can house all your shots and everything in production throughout the project. Next folder is just renders folder. We'll briefly talk about how to point towards this so we can get all our renders working into there, which is nice. And finals is pretty straightforward, just any final files after the project is completed. So that is my general folder structure. You can use it however you may like and obviously adapt it to your needs as well. For file naming conventions, this is the kind of file naming that generally works for me. This is for if I was running a project solo, so not actually needing to differentiate between who is working on which shot. And this is having a code at the beginning, so I just have GSG, PS for procedural systems, and I usually incorporate a section that can talk about what phase of the project or what specific thing I'm working on. So there'll be look dev, motion test, anything that can help kind of differentiate what specific aspect of the project that I'm working on. And then now just have example, but that would be your file name specifically, and then iterate up from there. Having file naming convention that works throughout your entire project is really important because then it just keeps everything super organized. You know exactly where everything is, and this file naming convention applies to everything across the board. If I'm developing assets, if I'm working on decks or whatever the case may be, renders as well, keeping within that file naming convention is super important. So Jumping into cinema, this is the kind of point in the project where I would maybe develop a kind of base scene file that I can propagate throughout. And so when I'm working on the project, I have everything kind of set up the way that I need it each time I start a new scene. And that is where you can set this and then save this as your new .c4d in your programs folder. And then each time that you start a new scene file, it'll keep all those settings for you, which is super helpful. So first off, I generally kind of have a similar structure for a lot of my scenes, and I want to keep this loose enough to where it's adaptable for each, but maybe it's a good idea to at least start everything on the right foot with having nulls that can organize all your different layers. So these are kind of the three base ones that I always have, and then it's dependent outside of that on each individual scene. But here I have this very complicated scene of 3 spheres here, and then a camera, and then this is where I would generally have lights and cycs and anything else that I would need for the environment. We are using Octane Render for the project, and while it's not the most robust in terms of production features or stability, it is a good render engine to utilize for quick style frames and motion tests, and generally just more kind of straightforward scenes and really quick look development as well. And pulling up our Octane settings here, you'll see everything's pretty straightforward. I want to kind of get rid of a lot of the things that Octane will try to influence in your render. So you'll see I killed all the vignetting, no post going on. And for our response, just going to make sure that that is linear with our 2.2 gamma as well. Everything else, again, is dependent on your personal scene file. So for this case, I just kind of have some lower depth values and we'll optimize those dependent on each scene. Now, looking over here at our specific render settings, first thing to note is, again, I want to set up a global scene file with global render settings that I can use throughout the project. And usually I'll save over that new .c4d per project if there's unique settings that I need that I know that I want global across the board. In this case, for our general render settings, we can get these all set up and not have to worry about it down the line. So one thing that is super useful about this is if you've ever used the Take system, which I hope you have because it's extremely useful, you can do similar things with our render settings. So if you know within Takes, once you create a general take, you can create a child take, and you can do the same thing with our render settings. So here I have HD animation. You can actually create a child take. So in this case, I want an HD still, and then any of these settings will inherit the parent take, except for the ones that you override. So in this case, for the still, I had just overridden the parent setting for frame range and changed it from all frames just to current frames. So I can have that still, but you can do this for any of your settings. So I have a hardware play blast here for when I just need to kick out different play blasts, and it'll inherit all the save settings and everything else. But then I just switched the render and adjusted everything else that I needed. So it's just super quick and super useful to be able to, if down the line, if you need to make a change to one of these settings, and everything else will just propagate to the children below, which is great. So for the still, we can take a look at Octane render settings that I'm using here. I try to get as much done possible in render. So again, it's kind of a case-by-case basis for which specific AOVs I'm kicking out. But one that I generally always use, because it's very useful when just doing color correction and post, is getting different object mats. So with this scene file, I just set that up as a baseline, and then for each scene, if I need specific AOVs kicked out, I can change those as well. But I have this set up to basically kick out different IDs based on these here. And this is set to the same path that I have for my save. And this is one useful thing to note is now that we have our folder structure set up and everything is universal in this regard, it means that anytime that I copy this folder structure, and if I'm using the same folder structure every time, then I can keep these render settings the same because it's going to reference the folder structure here. So what I have set up here is it's really straightforward. It's just these two dots are essentially saying this is the current folder. It's going up one folder. So if we're in our design space here, this is where the Cinema 4D file is. It's going to say, here's this folder. We're going to go up one. And then we're going to go into 07_renders, which is this here. And then from there, we're going to create a folder called project. So we'll just take our project name here. And you can get a list of all these tokens on this side as well. I generally just use project and camera, sometimes current frame. So it is going to dive up a folder, go back into our renders folder, create a folder called project. So it'll create this file name here, then create another folder within there called project_camera. So it's going to take this camera name, which I currently have named as cam wide main, and then within there, save out all the frames using project and camera again. And so why I have these double ones is you'll see once I render here, but I just want to create one overarching folder, and then within there I can have folders for each camera. So if I'm kicking out multiple different shots in different cameras, then I have these all organized within one overarching project, which is super useful. So for our render passes, using that same render pass, also rendering EXR at 32-bit, you can do a multi-layer file. I generally, just because After Effects, I do a lot of copying in After Effects, and it's really slow with their extractor to extract a multi-layer EXR. So I generally, especially when I'm only kicking out a couple different passes here, I'll do folders for those. Obviously, it increases exponentially in terms of how many different files you're going to have. So maybe you do multi-layer. It's kind of dependent on what your preference is, but it'll create folders for each of those. And then currently I just have an ID, which is for each of these. So just as an example. So let's hit render here, and I can show you why this is so useful. Let this render wildly high number of samples for the scene here. But so we had our design, it came out one level, dropped into our renders folder, created a folder with the name of our scene, created another folder with the name of our scene and our camera. And then within there, we have a scene with the name of our project, the name of our camera, and then folders for each of those mats. So I have one for each of the spheres. And again, this is going to be global if you're utilizing this folder structure for all of your projects. So you just have to set this up once, and then it'll propagate throughout the board, which is really awesome and definitely a time saver. But that is overall kind of my general settings that I utilize. It's primarily just taking the time to set up this scene file because, down the line when you have, tens or hundreds of different scenes and they all kind of have maybe a file that you hadn't necessarily taken the time to set up properly, then that just exponentially causes more time and more headaches. Yeah, hope this was helpful, and thanks for watching.